The arrest that shook a city. A calm afternoon turned nightmare. It was a warm afternoon in Rosewood Park, one of the few green spaces left in downtown Denver. The scent of blooming lilacs mixed with the distant aroma of food trucks lining the outer streets. Families sat on checkered blankets, children's laughter echoed through the air, and the rhythmic hum of a saxophone played by an elderly musician added a soothing undertone. Camille Rivers sat on a wooden bench near the pond, her caramel-toned fingers flipping through the pages of a worn leather journal. The breeze rustled her thick, dark curls as she adjusted her reading glasses. As a prominent civil rights attorney, her life revolved around courtrooms, case files, and long nights fighting for justice. This moment of stillness was rare. She closed her eyes, breathing in the tranquility. Then the world shattered. The screech of tires cutting through the park's serenity made heads turn. The black and white police cruiser skidded to a stop near the curb. Conversations hushed. Joggers slowed their pace. People turned their heads to see who the officers were after. Camille barely had time to look up before two uniformed officers, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other stockier, but with a permanent scowl, stepped out. Officer Ryan Murdoch led the way, his boots crunching on the gravel. His square jaw was set in an unreadable expression, but his posture screamed authority. His partner, Officer Kevin Sloan, had one hand resting on the gun at his hip, his piercing blue eyes scanning the park. Camille's fingers instinctively curled around her journal as the officers strode directly toward her. "Ma'am," Murdoch said, his voice edged with suspicion. "Can we have a word with you?" Interrogation in public view. Camille set her journal beside her and looked up calmly. "Of course. Is there a problem?" "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area," Sloan interjected, shifting his weight. "You match the description." Camille's stomach tightened, but her face remained impassive. She had spent her career defending clients against racial profiling. Now she was living it. "I'm reading a book," she said, her voice steady. "In a public park. I don't see how that qualifies as suspicious." Murdoch's eyes flickered to the journal beside her. "Do you always carry something like that?" Camille's brow arched. "A journal." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Yes. Is that a crime now? Can we see some identification?" Murdoch asked, the patience in his tone beginning to wane. She hesitated, knowing full well that hesitation could be used against her, but why should she have to justify her presence in a public space? Still, she reached into her tote bag and retrieved her wallet, handing over her driver's license. Murdoch studied it for an agonizingly long time before sneering. "Camille Rivers," he read, as if tasting the name. "What exactly is your business here today, Ms. Rivers?" Her fingers twitched, but she kept her voice even. "I live here. This is my city. I come to this park often." "Does that answer your question?" Sloan's expression hardened. "We need you to come with us to the station for further questioning." Camille straightened. "Am I being detained?" Murdoch's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're being uncooperative." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. A few people had already started recording on their phones. A young woman near the pond raised her phone higher, her camera locked onto the scene. Camille inhaled deeply. "I'm not resisting. I'm simply asking for clarification. If you're going to arrest me, you'd better have a valid charge." Murdoch's jaw clenched. That was all the provocation he seemed to need. His hand shot out, grabbing Camille's arm and yanking her to her feet. "Turn around," Sloan ordered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. A collective gasp spread through the park. "What is she even being arrested for?" a bystander called out. "This is ridiculous," another shouted. Camille locked eyes with the young woman holding her phone. Her expression conveyed a silent message. "Keep recording. Let the world see this." The cold metal of the cuffs snapped around her wrists. "Stop resisting," Murdoch barked, even though Camille stood completely still. The murmurs grew louder. The growing crowd pressed in, their outrage rising. As the officers led her toward the cruiser, Camille's breath remained steady. The door slammed shut behind her, silencing the outside noise. The engine roared to life, and the car pulled away. Her mind buzzed with 1,000 thoughts. She had spent her career fighting against this very injustice. Now she was the one in chains. And the fight was just beginning. A system built to intimidate. The ride to the station was suffocating. Camille sat rigid in the back of the police cruiser, her wrists aching from the too tight cuffs. The familiar streets of Denver blurred past her window, each landmark a painful reminder of how quickly her reality had shifted. Only an hour ago, she had been free, enjoying the sun-dappled tranquility of Rosewood Park. Now she was being hauled away like a criminal. The silence in the car was punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the police radio and the quiet muttering between Officers Murdoch and Sloan. She focused on steadying her breath. Stay calm. Observe everything. Remember every detail. As an attorney, she knew the law. She knew what they were doing was unlawful. But knowledge didn't protect her from the reality of power. She flexed her fingers, the metal of the handcuffs digging into her skin. "You know this is illegal, right?" she said, her voice level. Murdoch glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but said nothing. Sloan, however, smirked. "I'd save your lawyer talk for the station." Camille's jaw tightened. "Then tell me, what am I being charged with?" Murdoch exhaled through his nose, as if she was a mere nuisance. "Suspicion of obstruction of justice." She scoffed. "Sitting on a park bench with a book is obstruction of justice." "You refuse to comply." "No, I refuse to let you violate my rights." Sloan turned around in his seat, his smirk growing. "Lady, you're in cuffs. You can argue all you want, but that don't change the fact that we're the ones with the badges." Camille's hands curled into fists. She forced herself to exhale slowly. They wanted her to react. They wanted her angry. But she wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The cruiser pulled into the police station's parking lot just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, jagged shadows across the asphalt. The moment the doors opened, Camille was yanked out of the back seat. She barely had time to steady her footing before Sloan's firm grip guided her inside the building. Inside the system, harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant hung in the air. The front desk was manned by an older officer with graying hair and deep-set wrinkles, his expression one of indifference as he flipped through paperwork. Heads turned as Camille was led inside. Some officers spared her a passing glance. Others watched with mild curiosity. A few barely looked up at all. To them, she was just another name on a report. Murdoch led her to a processing desk where an officer with a clipboard sat waiting. "Name." The officer droned, barely looking up. "Camille Rivers," Murdoch answered for her, handing over her ID. The officer scribbled something down, flipping to the next form. "Charges: obstruction and resisting arrest." Camille's lips parted in disbelief. "I didn't resist." Murdoch tightened his grip on her arm in silent warning. The officer at the desk finally looked up. His gaze flickered between Camille and the two officers, skepticism flashing in his tired eyes. He hesitated but said nothing. "Step over there for your mugshot," he instructed instead, pointing to a dingy white wall. Camille's stomach turned. This was a moment she had witnessed countless times in her career. Clients led through this dehumanizing process, each step designed to break their spirit. And now, it was happening to her. She squared her shoulders and stepped in front of the camera. The flash was blinding, but it wasn't the light that stung. It was the reality of it all. A cold cell and a silent fight. After her fingerprints were taken, Murdoch and Sloan led her down a dimly lit hallway lined with metal doors. Each door had a small barred window. Shadowy figures moved behind them. A female officer, Officer Patel, met them at the cell door, her gaze flickering over Camille's handcuffed wrists before she unlocked the door. "Inside," she instructed. Camille hesitated. She turned back to Murdoch and Sloan, leveling them with a look. "This isn't over." Sloane chuckled. Oh, we know. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her. Camille stood still, adjusting to the silence of the cell. It was small, no larger than a walk-in closet. A metal bench was bolted to the wall. A toilet sat exposed in the corner, offering no privacy. The walls were a dull gray, stained with time and neglect. She exhaled slowly and sat on the bench, her mind already racing. What's the next move? Who can I call? Her first instinct was Marissa, her best friend, fellow attorney, and the one person she trusted to act fast. But there was no phone in sight, no way to reach the outside world. She had always advised her clients to stay calm, to document everything in their minds, and to never let the system break them. Now she had to take her own advice. She closed her eyes and replayed every moment since the arrest. The tension in their voices, the look in Murdoch's eyes when she questioned him, the way Sloane gripped his gun from the start, the young woman filming everything. That thought gave her hope. If the video was out there, someone would see it. Someone would act. She clung to that. Minutes stretched into hours. The cell was eerily quiet, save for the occasional muffled voice from another detainee. Camille forced herself to breathe deeply. She had spent years defending others. Now it was her turn to fight for herself. The first break in the case. At some point, she wasn't sure when. The metallic jingle of keys echoed down the hallway. Footsteps approached. The cell door creaked open. A young officer, one Camille hadn't seen before, stood with a clipboard in hand. His expression lacked the arrogance of Murdoch or Sloane. "Ms. Rivers," he said, "you're being released on bail." Camille stood, forcing her stiff legs to move. "And the charges?" The officer hesitated. "Still in place. You have a court date set for next week." A slow fire burned in her chest. She stepped out of the cell, rolling her shoulders. "Who posted my bail?" "Your lawyer," the officer answered. "And, the city's watching this case closely." A flicker of something passed across his face, something like guilt. Camille didn't respond. She simply walked, following the officer down the hall, past the processing desk, past the curious stares of other officers, past Murdoch and Sloane, who watched her with unreadable expressions. As she stepped outside, the crisp night air hit her like a wave. And there, waiting on the curb, was Marissa. Her best friend's expression was a mixture of relief and rage. The moment Camille reached her, Marissa wrapped her in a tight hug. "Are you okay?" she demanded, pulling back to inspect Camille. "I'm fine," Camille murmured, though exhaustion tugged at her. Marissa's eyes darkened. "They can't get away with this." "Oh," Camille exhaled, her exhaustion melting into determination. "We're not letting them." As they drove away, Camille already knew. This fight was far from over. And this time, she was going to win. The war for justice begins. The morning after. The battle lines are drawn. The scent of fresh coffee filled Camille's kitchen, but she barely noticed. She sat at the wooden table, surrounded by stacks of legal pads, court documents, and notes hastily scribbled during the early hours of the morning. Sleep had been an afterthought, an unattainable luxury in the face of what had just happened. Marissa sat across from her, dark circles under her eyes, but her energy razor sharp. She had been up all night too, poring over legal strategies, reading through similar cases, and making phone calls. "We need to get ahead of this," Marissa said, flipping through her tablet. "I don't trust the department's so-called internal investigation. If we don't control the narrative, they will." Camille nodded, running a hand through her thick curls. "We don't just need a defense. We need a counteroffensive." Marissa smirked. "That's the Camille I know." They were no longer just preparing for court. They were preparing for war. Marissa tapped on her screen. "Your arrest video went viral. It's already trending under #JusticeForCamille." Camille leaned in, her pulse quickening as she watched the footage of her arrest, taken from multiple angles by different bystanders. The raw emotion in the crowd, The disbelief in their voices as the officers handcuffed her, the sheer lack of resistance on her part. It was all there. "It's damning," Marissa said. "Murdoch and Sloan don't have a leg to stand on." "But that won't stop them from trying," Camille muttered. Marissa's lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to mobilize." Camille took a slow breath. She knew what needed to be done. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had ever been unjustly detained, humiliated, or silenced. It was time to fight back. Mobilizing the movement. Camille and Marissa wasted no time. By noon, they had contacted local activists, civil rights leaders, and journalists. Calls were made, emails sent, and a press conference was scheduled. By the afternoon, a strategy team had assembled in Camille's office. The room buzzed with energy. Young law students eager to help, community organizers fired up with righteous anger, and social justice advocates who had fought this battle before. "Here's the plan," Camille announced, standing at the front of the room, her confidence unwavering despite the exhaustion. 1. Public pressure. The footage of her arrest was already viral, but they needed to control the narrative. They would push for national media coverage, ensuring the department couldn't bury this under procedural red tape. 2. Legal counterattack. While her defense was important, they also had a civil rights lawsuit to file. She wouldn't just defend herself in court. She would go on the offensive. 3. Community protests. A peaceful demonstration was planned for Saturday outside the courthouse. The goal? Show the world that this was bigger than one woman in handcuffs. 4. Political pressure. Camille's legal connections would be leveraged to demand a real investigation, not just a performative review by the police department itself. "This isn't just about me," Camille said, scanning the room. "It's about everyone who has been in my position. This is about accountability, about justice, and about making sure this never happens again." A wave of determination swept through the room. The fight had begun. The department's damage control begins. The next morning, Camille's phone buzzed nonstop. Headlines flashed across major news sites. Civil rights attorney arrested in park without cause. Denver PD under fire. Police chief promises internal review amid rising public outrage. Protest planned after attorney's wrongful arrest sparks national backlash. Camille exhaled as she scrolled through the coverage. The department was already trying to get ahead of the scandal. Denver PD's official statement had just been released. The officers involved in the arrest of Ms. Rivers acted in response to a call regarding suspicious activity. While we understand the concerns raised by the public, we ask for patience as we conduct an internal review to ensure full transparency. Marissa snorted. Translation. They're scrambling. Camille's gaze darkened. We're not waiting for them to clear their own names. We're taking action. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in a long time. It rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. Camille. Hi, Judge Carter. Judge Derek Carter had been a mentor to her in law school, one of the few people in the system she truly trusted. I saw the news, he said, his voice edged with concern. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said, but I need your help. A pause. Then, tell me what you need. The press conference, taking back the narrative. Later that afternoon, Camille stood at a podium outside the Denver courthouse. Journalists, activists, and community members crowded the steps, cameras flashing. She took a breath and faced the world. I was arrested for reading a book in a public park. Her voice was clear, strong. The officers who detained me had no cause, no justification, only their own bias. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I am a civil rights attorney, she continued. I have dedicated my life to fighting for justice, and now I find myself on the other side of the very system I had spent years trying to fix. She paused, scanning the sea of faces. But this isn't just about me. This is about every black man and woman who has been targeted, harassed, or profiled for simply existing. This is about accountability. A burst of applause rang out. Camille leaned forward. We are demanding answers. We are demanding action. And we are demanding justice. The crowd erupted. The movement had begun. A warning from the other side. That evening, Camille's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. A deep, gravelly voice greeted her. Ms. Rivers. Camille stiffened. Who is this? A concerned party, the voice replied. You're making a lot of noise. It might be in your best interest to quiet down. Her pulse quickened, but her voice remained even. Are you threatening me? I'm giving you advice. A cold silence stretched between them. Then the line went dead. Camille slowly lowered the phone. Marissa, who had been listening nearby, frowned. What was that about? Camille clenched her jaw. They're scared. Marissa's eyes darkened. Then we hit them harder. Camille nodded, determination burning in her chest. The fight wasn't just about a wrongful arrest anymore. This was about tearing down the whole corrupt system. And Camille was ready to bring it all crashing down. The walls of power tremble. The threat that changed everything. Camille sat in silence, gripping her phone. The voice from the other end of the call still echoed in her mind. You're making a lot of noise. It might be in your best interest to quiet down. Marissa stood across the kitchen, arms crossed. That was a threat. Camille nodded slowly, her jaw tightening. They want me to back off. Marissa scoffed. Then they don't know you at all. She was right. If anything, the call only fueled Camille's fire. But something had changed. This wasn't just about her arrest anymore. Someone, somewhere in power, was afraid. And that meant she was getting dangerously close to something bigger. The battle wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing everything. The silent hand of corruption. Camille wasted no time. She contacted Judge Derek Carter again. He had served on the bench for over 20 years and had seen his fair share of corruption. If anyone could help navigate this storm, it was him. They met at a quiet cafe, far from prying ears. You're pushing against the system, Carter said, stirring his coffee. And the system doesn't like to be pushed. Camille took a slow sip of her own drink. They're scared. Carter nodded. And that should tell you something. He leaned forward, voice lowering. I did some digging after your arrest. Those two officers, Murdoch and Sloan. What about them? They're not just your standard bad cops. They're part of a pattern. Camille frowned. What kind of pattern? Judge Carter slid a thin manila folder across the table. She opened it and her stomach dropped. Inside were dozens of complaints, wrongful arrests, excessive force reports, and disturbing patterns of targeting black citizens. Many of the complaints had been dismissed without investigation. They've been doing this for years, Carter said grimly, and they've been protected. Camille clenched her fists. By who? Carter hesitated, then sighed. Higher up than just the department. A chill ran through Camille's spine. This wasn't just two corrupt cops. This was a whole network. And now, she had the proof. The system fights back. The next morning, Camille received another surprise. She was halfway through drafting a motion when Marissa stormed into her office, slamming a newspaper onto the desk. Camille glanced at the front page. ATTORADY, under fire for STAGGDARREST. Sources claim Camille Rivers orchestrated incident for political gain. Her breath caught. What the hell is this? She hissed. Marissa shook her head, furious. They're smearing you. Camille's stomach twisted as she read through the false claims. That she had antagonized the officers. That she had provoked an incident for publicity. That she was a known activist with an anti-police agenda. The article even quoted a high-ranking police official who claimed Camille had refused to cooperate and had fabricated a civil rights violation. It was all lies. Camille's hands trembled as she pushed the newspaper away. They're trying to bury me. Marissa's eyes blazed. So what do we do? Camille inhaled deeply, then met her friend's gaze. We fight back. The power of truth. The press conference was held that afternoon. A larger crowd had gathered this time. News cameras, activists, and a flood of supporters. Camille stepped up to the microphone. She held up the newspaper for everyone to see. "This," she said, her voice calm but firm, "is what happens when you challenge power." A hush fell over the crowd. "They want you to believe that I staged my own arrest, that I somehow planned for 2 officers to handcuff me in broad daylight. For what? Attention. Political gain." She let the silence linger. "Let me be clear," she continued. "This is not about me. This is about every person who has been harassed, detained, or profiled simply for existing. And now they want to discredit me, because I have something they fear: the truth." The crowd erupted in cheers. Camille took a slow breath. "Let me show you something," she said. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out the manila folder Judge Carter had given her. "These are dozens of complaints against Officers Murdoch and Sloan," she declared, flipping through the documents. "Dozens of cases just like mine, swept under the rug." Gasps rippled through the audience. A reporter in the front row leaned forward. "Ms. Rivers, are you saying this is part of a larger pattern?" "Yes." Camille's voice hardened. "I am saying that this is systemic corruption, and I intend to expose it." The cameras flashed wildly. The movement had just gone beyond Camille's case. This was bigger than one wrongful arrest. This was a war for justice. The department loses control. That evening, another headline hit the news. "Dozens of complaints uncovered against DNVR-PD officers, Murdoch and Sloan under investigation for pattern of misconduct. Civil rights filed against DNVR Police Department." The department scrambled. For the first time, they weren't just reviewing the case. They were losing control of the narrative. A public inquiry was demanded. Political leaders were forced to address the scandal. And behind closed doors, people in power were panicking. Camille knew she was getting too close to something dangerous. But she wasn't stopping now. The next attack. The threats escalated. Anonymous emails. Blocked calls. Unmarked cars sitting outside her home. She wasn't scared. She was angry. Then, late one night, she received a different kind of call. Her phone buzzed at 2:14 a.m. She hesitated before answering. A familiar voice came through the line. "Camille, it's Maya." Maya, the young woman who had filmed her arrest. Her voice was shaky. "They're threatening me," Maya whispered. "They found out I recorded everything. They came to my job. They..." The line went dead. Camille's heart pounded. They were going after witnesses now. She grabbed her coat, her keys, her phone. Marissa rushed out of her bedroom. "What's wrong?" Camille's hands trembled with fury. They just made their biggest mistake. Marissa frowned. "Which is?" Camille turned to her, eyes burning with fire. "They think they can scare me into stopping." She grabbed her phone and dialed. Judge Carter. His voice was groggy but alert. "Camille, I need you to sign a protection order for my witness." She grabbed a file from the table. The lawsuit she had just finalized. "And we're filing this tomorrow." Marissa's lips curled into a smirk. "Let's bring the whole damn house down. The fire that won't die." The attack on the witness. Camille and Marissa sped through the streets of Denver, the city lights streaking past like ghosts. The tires screeched as they pulled up to Maya's apartment building, a modest, aging complex in a quieter part of the city. The second Camille stepped out of the car, she noticed something off. The front door was ajar. She froze. Marissa swore under her breath. "This isn't good." They hurried up the stairwell, Camille's heart pounding in her chest. She reached Maya's door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. Then she pushed. The door swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. Maya's apartment was ransacked. Bookshelves overturned. Papers scattered everywhere. A coffee table broken. The lamp lay shattered on the carpet. Marissa inhaled sharply. Jesus. Camille's stomach twisted. Maya. A soft noise, a muffled whimper, came from the corner. Camille rushed forward, pushing past an overturned chair. Maya was huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, her phone still clutched in her hands. She looked up with wide, terrified eyes. They were here. Camille dropped to her knees beside her. Are you hurt? Maya shook her head quickly. No, but they. She shivered, unable to finish. Marissa crouched next to them, scanning the room. They weren't just here to scare her. They were looking for something. Maya tightened her grip on her phone. I think they were looking for this. She slowly handed Camille her phone. Camille's pulse quickened. The original footage. Maya nodded. And more. Camille swallowed hard. What do you mean more? Maya hesitated. I wasn't the only one filming. Camille and Marissa exchanged a look. There's another video. Maya nodded. I haven't seen it yet, but a guy at the park, he recorded everything from a different angle. He messaged me earlier and said his video caught something the others missed. Camille gripped her shoulder. Where is he? Maya bit her lip. Scared. He doesn't want to come forward. He said he saw something that made him afraid for his life. Marissa exhaled. That means whatever he has is big. Camille nodded. And we need to see it. Now. The missing puzzle piece. An hour later, the three of them sat in Camille's apartment, the laptop open on the coffee table. Maya had finally convinced the second witness, a man named Devin Cross, to send his footage. A shaky, grainy video file pinged into her inbox. Camille clicked it open. At first, the footage looked similar to Maya's. The officers approaching, the exchange, the wrongful arrest. But then, something different. From this angle, Devin's camera had caught Murdoch stepping away from Camille for a brief moment. She hadn't noticed it before. Neither had the crowd. Murdoch walked to the side and pulled out his radio. Camille and Marissa leaned forward. The footage had audio. Murdoch pressed the radio to his mouth. Yeah, we got her. Moving forward with the plan. Camille's breath hitched. Marissa's eyes widened. Maya covered her mouth with her hands. They rewound it. Played it again. Yeah, we got her. Moving forward with the plan. The plan. Camille's blood ran cold. Murdoch's words weren't just about arresting her. This had been premeditated. A setup. Marissa whispered, "Oh my God." Maya shook her head, eyes brimming with fear. This wasn't just racial profiling. They were sent for you. Camille felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Someone ordered this. Someone wanted her arrested. Someone in power. She gritted her teeth. Well, Camille's voice was deadly calm. Now we know. Marissa sat back, stunned. What the hell do we do now? Camille closed her laptop. We take this straight to the judge. Bringing it to the court. At dawn, Camille stood outside the Denver courthouse, gripping a thick stack of legal documents in her hands. She was filing two things today. 1. A motion to dismiss her criminal charges, citing evidence of premeditated misconduct. 2. A federal lawsuit against the Denver Police Department for civil rights violations. Judge Carter met her at the courthouse steps. He had already seen the footage. His face was grim. This is explosive, he admitted. Camille nodded. I need a restraining order against Murdoch and Sloan, and I need this case moved to federal jurisdiction. Carter sighed. I can grant the restraining order, but getting this federal, that's a battle. Camille met his gaze without blinking. Then we fight that battle. Carter studied her for a long moment. Then he gave a small nod. Let's bring them down. The fallout begins. The lawsuit filing exploded in the news. New video footage MMPLICATE is POLICN PROI MEDTAKEARREST Titor NEY Camille Rivers file is federal LAWSUIT against DNVRPD. The police department went into full panic mode. Murdoch and Sloan were placed on immediate suspension. The mayor called for an independent investigation. Protest crowds tripled in size. And then, Camille received a second phone call. This time, the number was blocked. She answered. A different voice. Deeper, colder, more dangerous. "Ms. Rivers," the man said, "I strongly advise you to back down." Camille smiled. "Oh, honey," she said smoothly, "you're gonna have to try a lot harder than that." A pause. Then the line went dead. Marissa, sitting beside her, raised an eyebrow. That sounded like a death threat. Camille cracked her knuckles. It sounded like they're running out of options. Marissa grinned. "That means we're winning." Camille smirked. "Dan right. The courtroom showdown. A reckoning begins. The world is watching." The morning of Camille Rivers' court date arrived with an electricity that crackled in the air. The courthouse steps were packed. Reporters lined the sidewalks. Protesters held signs that read "Justice for Camille" and "Hold them accountable." A sea of people stood outside the towering stone courthouse, their voices rising in chants. This wasn't just another hearing. This was a battle for justice, and Camille was walking into it ready for war. She emerged from the sleek black car, stepping onto the pavement like a soldier preparing to march. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, she looked unstoppable. Marissa walked beside her, whispering updates. "Judge Carter is presiding." Camille nodded. "Good." The DA's office refused to drop the charges, but they're scrambling. They know the video changes everything. Camille smirked. "Let them scramble." Marissa exhaled. "You ready?" Camille looked up at the courthouse, at the symbol of justice she had believed in for so long. More than ever. They ascended the steps as cameras flashed. Journalists shouted questions, and the world watched. This was her moment. The system had tried to silence her. Now she would force it to listen. Inside the lion's den, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The wooden benches were filled with journalists, activists, and law students taking notes. At the defendant's table, Murdoch and Sloan sat stiffly in their uniforms, their lawyer whispering urgently to them. Their faces were pale. They knew what was coming. Judge Carter entered, his expression neutral but his gaze sharp. "All rise." The courtroom stood. Carter took his seat, adjusting his glasses before leveling his gaze at the attorneys before him. "Ms. Rivers," he said, his deep voice carrying authority, "are you ready to proceed?" Camille stood, her heart steady. "Yes, Your Honor." The opening statements. Truth versus lies. The prosecutor rose first. A man named Richard Calloway, a district attorney who had built his career defending police misconduct. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," he began, pacing slightly. "The case before us today is not about racial bias, political agendas, or media outrage." Camille's eyebrow twitched. "That's exactly what this was about." Calloway continued, "This case is about law and order. The officers had reasonable suspicion to question Ms. Rivers in the park that day. She refused to comply, escalating the situation. A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Camille kept her face unreadable, but her fingers curled slightly on the desk. Lies. Calloway turned to the jury. The officers acted in good faith. They did their duty. Nothing more. Nothing less. He sat down, looking pleased with himself. Then, Camille stood. She approached the jury with calm, measured steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said smoothly, "what you just heard was a masterclass in manipulation." Calloway shifted uncomfortably. The prosecution would have you believe this case is about law and order, but let me tell you what this case is actually about. She turned, facing the entire room. This is about power. About two officers who thought they could abuse their authority without consequence. This is about a system that lets them get away with it. Silence. The jury was hooked. The judge nodded. Proceed. The evidence that changed everything. Camille's team wasted no time. They played the arrest footage from multiple angles. The jury watched as Camille sat peacefully on a park bench, reading. The officers approached aggressively, with no reasonable suspicion. They escalated the situation unnecessarily. Murdoch and Sloan falsely claimed Camille was resisting. Then came the new footage. The video from Devon Cross. The courtroom gasped as they heard Murdoch's voice on the police radio. Yeah, we got her. Moving forward with the plan. A plan. A setup. The video ended. A long, heavy silence followed. Calloway shifted in his seat, his face visibly pale. Camille turned back to the jury. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a targeted arrest. This was a crime. The jury's expressions hardened. She had them. Cross-examination. The officers fall apart. Murdoch was called to the stand. The once arrogant officer looked smaller now, his uniform suddenly less intimidating. Camille approached, her voice calm and lethal. Officer Murdoch, she said, tilting her head. Tell me, what exactly was suspicious about me sitting in a park? Murdoch swallowed. Well, we received a call. Camille cut him off. A call from whom? Murdoch hesitated. We don't have the caller on record. Camille arched an eyebrow. So let me get this straight. You received a call about suspicious activity. You don't know who made the call. You arrived and saw me. What? Reading? Murdoch's jaw clenched. You refused to cooperate. Camille smiled. No. I refuse to be unlawfully detained. Silence. Camille leaned in slightly. Now tell me, Officer Murdoch, what did you mean when you said, moving forward with the plan? Murdoch froze. Calloway jumped up. Objection. Overruled, Judge Carter said. Camille repeated, her voice slow and deliberate. What? Plan. Murdoch stammered. I don't recall. Camille folded her arms. I think you do. Sweat beaded on Murdoch's forehead. Sloan sat at the defense table, his hands clenched into fists. The officers were crumbling. The jury saw it. The press saw it. Everyone saw it. The verdict that shook the system. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Camille stood, her hands gripping the edge of the table as the judge asked, Has the jury reached a verdict? The jury foreperson stood. In the case of the state versus Camille Rivers, we find the defendant not guilty. A rush of relief flooded through Camille's body. But the foreperson wasn't done. In the case of the people versus officers Ryan Murdoch and Kevin Sloan, we find the defendants guilty of misconduct, unlawful detention, and abuse of power. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Murdoch's face went white. Sloan slammed his fist on the table. Camille exhaled. She had won. And justice had finally been served. The aftermath. A fire that won't die. Outside the courthouse, Camille faced the sea of reporters. She took the microphone, her voice strong and steady. This is just the beginning. Applause erupted. The system tried to bury me. Instead, it showed the world its own corruption. Now, we change it. We demand better. We hold them accountable. We don't stop. The crowd cheered. The movement grew stronger. And Camille Rivers, once the wrongfully arrested attorney, was now a symbol of unstoppable justice. The war wasn't over. But the system had just learned a painful lesson. Camille wasn't going anywhere. And neither was the truth. The legacy of justice. A new era begins. A victory that shook the nation. The air outside the courthouse was electric. The moment the guilty verdict was read, the streets erupted into cheers, applause, and chants of victory. Justice had been served. Murdoch and Sloan, once untouchable officers shielded by the system, were now convicted criminals. But for Camille Rivers, this was never just about one case. This was about change. This was about breaking the cycle. As she stepped outside to face the crowd of journalists, activists, and everyday citizens who had fought beside her, she felt the weight of this moment, the beginning of something greater. The movement was no longer just about her wrongful arrest. It was about a system that had been broken for too long. And now, that system was shaking. The next fight begins. The night after the trial, Camille sat in her apartment, her desk cluttered with stacks of legal briefs, case files, and a laptop flooded with emails. She was exhausted, but she couldn't stop now. Murdoch and Sloan's convictions were just the first domino to fall. Now, the real battle was beginning. Her civil rights lawsuit against the Denver Police Department was moving forward at full speed. The evidence uncovered during the trial, patterns of misconduct, illegal targeting of black citizens, and internal corruption, was too big to ignore. The mayor had no choice but to launch an independent investigation. Federal oversight agencies were getting involved. And Camille, she was leading the charge. A new enemy emerges. But just as quickly as the system had begun to bend, the people who had spent years protecting it started to fight back. Camille's phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Blocked number. She let it ring. Then, a text message appeared. Drop the lawsuit, or face the consequences. Camille's hands tightened around her phone. Another message followed. You don't know who you're dealing with. Marissa, sitting across the room, frowned. Another threat. Camille exhaled. They're getting desperate. Marissa scoffed. Good. But Camille wasn't naive. This fight was bigger than Murdoch and Sloan. This was about the entire system. And when a system feels threatened, it fights dirty. The power play in Washington. Camille's case wasn't just shaking Denver. It was making national headlines. Calls from senators, civil rights organizations, and high-profile legal experts poured in. Even the Department of Justice was taking notice. Then, one morning, her assistant knocked on her office door. Camille, he said, looking almost nervous. You have a visitor. Camille frowned. Who is it? The assistant hesitated. They say they're from the White House. A meeting that could change everything. Camille found herself seated across from Elena Morales, a senior advisor to the President of the United States. The air in the room was thick with tension. Elena leaned forward, her sharp eyes locked onto Camille's. You're making a lot of people nervous, Elena said. Camille smirked. Good. Elena exhaled. Look, I'm going to be blunt. The President's team is watching your case closely. We're aware of the corruption your lawsuit is exposing. Camille raised an eyebrow. So what are you saying? Elena sat back, choosing her words carefully. The administration is considering major police reform. If your case goes the way we expect, it could be the catalyst for national change. Camille's heart pounded. This was bigger than she had imagined. Elena continued. The question is, are you willing to take this fight beyond Denver? Beyond the courtroom? Camille didn't hesitate. I've spent my whole life preparing for this fight. Elena nodded. Then let's change this country. The lawsuit that shattered a city. Weeks passed. The lawsuit against the Denver Police Department went to trial. And this time, it wasn't just about Camille's wrongful arrest. It was about every single victim of police misconduct who had been ignored, dismissed, or buried by the system. The evidence presented was devastating. Hundreds of complaints ignored. Falsified reports protecting corrupt officers. Black citizens were 5 times more likely to be stopped without cause. A network of internal cover-ups reaching the highest levels. The city's defense team tried to downplay it. Tried to claim Camille's lawsuit was politically motivated. tried to silence her. But the truth was out. And once the truth is out, you can't put it back. The final verdict: a system falls. 3 months later, the Denver courtroom was filled again. The city held its breath as the judge prepared to deliver the ruling. Camille stood at the plaintiff's table, Marissa beside her, the weight of history on her shoulders. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses and looked at the packed courtroom. In the matter of Rivers versus the city of Denver, we find that the Denver Police Department engaged in systemic racial profiling and misconduct. A collective gasp echoed. Judge Carter continued, "We further order immediate federal oversight, mandatory policy reforms, and a financial settlement of $15 million to affected individuals." Silence. Then, the city erutted. The aftermath. A new future. The lawsuit's victory sent shockwaves across the country. The Denver Police Department was placed under federal supervision. Dozens of corrupt officers were fired or charged. Statewide police reform bills were introduced. And Camille? She became the face of the movement. The law firm she had built expanded nationwide, fighting cases of police brutality and civil rights violations in every major city. One night, as she sat in her new office overlooking the Denver skyline, Marissa poured them both a drink. "We did it," Marissa said, clinking her glass against Camille's. Camille smiled. No. She looked out at the city that had once tried to break her. "We just got started." Epilogue. A legacy that won't die. Years later, Camille stood at the steps of the United States Supreme Court. A new case. A bigger battle. One that could change policing forever. The cameras flashed. The world waited. She stepped forward, standing tall, because this fight was never just about her. It was about all of them. And she would never stop. Not until the system finally belonged to the people. For good. The revolution begins. The Supreme Court battle. Years had passed since Camille Rivers' fight had begun on the steps of a Denver courthouse. Now she stood at the highest legal battleground in the nation, the United States Supreme Court. The case before the court wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about Denver. It was about America. Rivers v. the United States was a case that could reshape policing nationwide. It wasn't just about reform. It was about fundamental change. For years, Camille had fought tirelessly, working with civil rights groups, challenging laws that allowed officers to abuse power without consequence, and helping families who had suffered under a broken system. But this case was different. If she won today, it would mean the end of qualified immunity, the legal shield that protected officers from being held accountable for their actions. This was the final fight. The courtroom was packed with attorneys, journalists, and spectators who knew the weight of this moment. As Camille stood before the 9 Supreme Court justices, she inhaled deeply. She was ready. The final argument. "Your Honors," Camille began, her voice clear and unwavering. "For decades, our justice system has operated under an unspoken rule, one that allows those in power to escape accountability." She walked toward the bench, her words measured, calculated. When officers violate the rights of the people, they are protected by a doctrine that allows them to say, "We didn't know it was illegal." But tell me this, Your Honors. What kind of law allows the enforcers of justice to claim ignorance of justice itself? A murmur rippled through the audience. Camille turned to the jury. Qualified immunity has allowed officers to kill, to brutalize, to harass, and to walk away without consequence. She paused, then held up a thick binder. In this binder are the names of over 5,000 people, men, women, children, who have been victims of police misconduct. Their families were given no justice, because the law said, "We didn't know this was wrong." She let her words hang in the air. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. Because when the people fear law enforcement, and law enforcement fears no one, we are no longer living in a democracy. We are living under occupation. She placed the binder on the podium. "This court has a choice today," she said, looking each justice in the eye. "Either continue protecting a broken system, or stand on the side of the Constitution and return power to the people." The chamber was silent. Even the justices, hardened by years of political debates, looked shaken. Camille sat down. She had said all she needed to say. Now it was up to the court. The verdict that changed America. 3 months later, the ruling was announced. Camille sat in her office, her team gathered around, watching the live broadcast. The Chief Justice cleared his throat. "In the matter of Rivers v. the United States, this court finds that the doctrine of qualified immunity violates the constitutional rights of American citizens. Effective immediately, all law enforcement officers are no longer immune from civil lawsuits when they engage in unconstitutional actions." The room erupted into cheers. Marissa grabbed Camille's shoulders, shaking her. "You did it." Camille exhaled sharply, closing her eyes for just a second. She had won. But it wasn't just her victory. It was America's victory. Because for the first time, in hundreds of years, the law finally protected the people. One last speech. Later that night, Camille stood at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Thousands had gathered, holding candles in honor of those lost to police brutality. She stepped up to the microphone, the night air crisp against her skin. She looked out at the sea of faces, young, old, black, white, brown, all standing together. And she smiled. "This isn't the end," she said, her voice steady. "This is the beginning." The crowd roared. "We did not fight for revenge. We fought for justice. And today, for the first time in history, we won." She pointed toward the Capitol in the distance. "But make no mistake, this was only a battle. The war for justice never ends. Because justice isn't a destination. It's a fight we take up every single day." The crowd erupted. As Camille stepped back, Marissa leaned in and whispered, "So what's next?" Camille grinned. "Whatever it takes." And as the candles flickered in the night, the world knew one thing. Camille Rivers had changed the system forever. And she was just getting started.